My name is Tom Lindsay. I work here at TPPF, and I want to welcome you all to our book talk with author John Davidson, who has written Pagan America, which we will be discussing for about the next hour. For the first half hour, John and I will be discussing his book, and then we'll open it up to your questions. A little bit of biographical information here on John first. John's a senior editor at The Federalist, which is a news site, which if you're not familiar with it, I recommend it. It's very good. He has nearly a 20-year career in journalism, and his writings have appeared in national publications including the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, the Guardian, the Claremont Review of Books, the New York Post, First Things, and elsewhere. He's also appeared on various media outlets and podcasts, including Tucker Carlson, and I think you just did a podcast with Tucker, yes, as well as the Ingram Angle, Fox and Friends, NPR, the BBC, and the Megyn Kelly Show. John is a proud graduate of Hillsdale College. Right. And although a Texan for many years, John now lives with his family in Alaska? Yes, in Alaska, which is a logical move from Texas to Alaska.
I'm from Alaska, so
yes,
you have to include that detail.
He is from Alaska. All right. Before I sit down and discuss with John the argument of his book, let me read a statement from the late Roman Catholic Cardinal George of Chicago, who said about 15 years ago the following. Cardinal George said, quote, "I expect to die in my bed. I expect that my successor will die in prison. I expect that his successor will die a martyr in the public square." But he added that after the martyred bishop, he said his successor, quote, "will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history," unquote. Both the reasons for our fall and the reason for our hope of rebirth are the subjects of John's book. Please join me in welcoming John Davidson.
Thanks, Tom. One thing you didn't mention in your introduction is that I used to work here with you.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
And with many people who are here.
Yes.
So
My error. John used to work here. John, I'm sure people reading your book would have 100 questions in addition to 100 compliments. I mean, this is a very ambitious book, and in my view, John has been just as successful as he has been ambitious. So by way of that, let me ask you the first question.
Yeah.
One of the more controversial claims because of our society today is this. You say that America was founded as a, quote, Christian nation, right? Now, what we commonly hear, what students are taught in too many schools, is that we're a secular nation with a, quote, wall of separation between church and state, unquote. Although I don't think many of them know where that quote originally comes from. So which is it? Are we a Christian nation, as you hold, or as others hold, are we a secular nation?
Yeah, that's a good question, a great place to start. I think there's a misconception that there's a difference or a tension between being a Christian nation and a secular nation. Secularism is itself a creation of Christian civilization, right? The idea of a public square where everyone can speak, right? The idea of a government that is accountable to the people it governs and that derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. All of these things are things that you get from Christianity. There's no basis for them in any other system of belief, right? So the seeming tension between a secular nation and a Christian nation, I think, is a little misplaced. But But going back to maybe before we get to that point, I think we have to be clear about how we have slowly misunderstood this idea, this wall of separation between church and state. The line from the Jefferson letter that so often gets misunderstood. In the full context of that letter, of course, that phrase doesn't appear in the Constitution or anything like that. He was talking about encroachments on the church by the state, right? Not about the influence of Christian religion or religious belief and practice on the public square and on the life of the nation, right? I think it's pretty clear when you look at the founders and what they said about what it was they thought they were doing, that they were creating a society, and they said this themselves over and over again in pretty clear, unmistakable terms, that the kind of society they envisioned, a republic of self-governing citizens, was the kind of only a society like that, you could only have that with a Christian people, a moral and religious people, right? And they weren't talking about Islam when they said moral and religious. They were talking about a Christian civilization, a Christian society that held Christian truths about the human person and about our obligations to one another and our relationship to God and the created order. That was the kind of society that you could have a republican form of government, because, and this is the key thing I think that gets lost in the discussion, because in that kind of a society, you have the basis for things like individual rights. You have grounds for things like consent, freedom of speech. There's no reason why a person who rejects the Christian claims of like Imago Dei, that we're created in the image of God, should care about the rights or the fate of a group of people that are weak and dependent, right? And in pagan societies, not to jump ahead, but in pagan societies, it was considered morally justified to take what those weak people had for you and your own people, and to destroy them or subjugate them or enslave them. And that has been the pattern across time and geography and cultures and peoples in non-Christian pagan societies. Because they're operating from different priors about human beings and a well-ordered society. Our society is based on Christian principles and values. And one of the arguments of the book is that you cannot keep the form of Western society, the form of American republicanism, without the religious beliefs that undergird it, right? That once those go, then human rights go, consent to the governed goes, freedom of speech and religion, all that goes. And it's not going to take centuries or generations. I argue that it's happening right now.
Thank you. Let's continue on that line of thought. You argue that the American way of life that we have all cherished can only be preserved if we remain a predominantly Christian people. The other side, as we all know, says that individual liberty means that we tolerate differences, including differences in religious belief, right, or no belief,
right,
as far as they're concerned. How do you?
Yeah, so this is really an extension of what I was just saying. That tolerating differences in religious belief is a luxury good that only a Christian society can afford, right? That's why you don't see religious toleration in the Islamic world, for example, right? And you didn't see religious toleration in the communist world back when we had that. The idea that there will be no compulsion, that I won't coerce you into believing exactly what I believe, that I won't convert you by the sword, it is a Christian idea and was historically a Christian reality. Now, of course, I can hear the objections, like, in cases of colonialism or of conquest. But by and large, Christianity didn't spread over the world by conquering armies, right? Christianity spread by conversion and the conversion of peoples. And that is not how pagan empires spread across the world. They spread through conquest and coercion. And so the idea of a tolerant public square and of religious pluralism, and of pluralism at all, is something that only arises in Christian societies, and can only survive in a predominantly Christian society. That's why I say it's a luxury good. We, as Christians, we are taught and we believe that we cannot forcibly convert anyone. It's actually impossible, right? According to Christian teaching. And we also believe that every person is made in the image and likeness of God and has inherent dignity, and has rights that have to be respected. And I go into this in the book too. These aren't things that the founders came up with. They're not creations of modernity. They go back to medieval Catholic Europe, and these things were articulated very clearly, very early on. They're not with apologies to the Protestants in the crowd, they're not a creation of the Reformation. They were part of Christianity from the beginning. And they found a unique expression in the American founding, and that's the society that we had for most of our history, and that is going away now because we're losing the basis for that society, which is our faith.
Yes, you talk a little bit about the Aztecs and Cortez, and what students hear nowadays is Cortez and all the others, conquistadors looking for gold, bad people. Look what they did to the indigenous Aztec culture, which in your book, Aztec Culture, shows us something about what life is like under paganism. Would you tell us a little bit about Aztec culture and why Cortez thought that it was his duty to God to fight them?
Yeah. Aztec culture was a rich and peaceful culture. No, I'm just kidding. I can't remember if I mentioned this in the book or not, but I've been to Mexico City a number of times in recent years. In some cases, actually, with TPPF delegations of TPPF folks. On one occasion, I went to their National Anthropological Museum and Museum of sort of Mexican civilization, and there's these huge artifacts of Aztec, the Aztec civilization, these huge sculptures in this hall, and it's an amazing display. It's very detailed, telling all about Aztec civilization, where it came from, and how they sort of conquered what is now Mexico and all the neighboring peoples. But it says very little about how it went away and what happened to it. And over in the corner on the way out, there's like a little poster that's like about Cortez, and it's like Cortez came, and then it was the Aztecs were done after that. But they're ashamed of their own. Like, Cortez to me should be the George Washington of Mexico, right? Like, he should be celebrated there because he swept away an unimaginably brutal, I would say demonic culture that was based upon industrial scale human sacrifice. About 30 years before Aztec landed at Veracruz, True Cross, right? He named the place he landed True Cross. The Templo Mayor in what is now Mexico City was sort of christened. They had built this massive temple complex, and they christened it with a 4-day festival in which something like 80,000 people were sacrificed. That was just the beginning of what became a routine practice, a daily practice of human sacrifice at Templo Mayor. The place was a charnel house, right, on an ongoing basis, and not just. I mean, I won't describe. If you want to know all about it, read the book, but we won't talk about it here because it's pretty graphic. But suffice to say, the absolutely an evil. Demonic civilization that was based upon the ritual slaughter of human beings to bloodthirsty and insatiable gods. So Cortez arrives, sees this, and determines to destroy it. And one of the points I make in the book is that Cortez could have looked the other way. Montezuma II would have paid him good money to leave them alone. And other conquistadors did that and enriched themselves. It would have been an easy way, much easier way than what he ended up doing. But he was motivated by something more than just gold, right? He was a devout and genuinely believing Catholic, and he saw what Aztec civilization was, and he determined to destroy it, and that's what he did. And Mexico owes it's the life of the nation as it is today, and it's not a place. It's obviously a place with a lot of problems, but it's not the Aztec Empire, right? He swept that away, and we see this pattern, and I talk about this in the first chapter across vast expanses of time and space and cultures. it's the encounter with Christianity that topples pagan regimes. Absent that, they persist and they attain greater and greater civilizational forms. And the more advanced the pagan empire or the pagan regime, the more bloodthirsty and cruel and wicked they become. So when you think of something like the Aztecs had conquered all their neighbors, and in fact, their whole society was based upon extracting slaves and sacrificial victims from the neighboring peoples around them, the peoples that would eventually ally with Cortez to defeat the Aztecs. Even their battlefield tactics were based upon the need to capture enemy warriors alive so they could sacrifice them, a tactic that Cortez figured out and used to his advantage later on. But this is the same, the ancient Egyptians, a pagan slave society, the ancient Carthaginians, a slave society, the Aztecs, the ancient Incas, even the Romans, got away from human sacrifice, but still engaged in animal sacrifices. And arguably the Colosseums and the gladiatorial games were a form of pagan sacrifice as well, for the sake of the empire and the greater good, right? So I talk about that in the book, that this pattern repeats over and over, and it's the encounter with Christianity that breaks these regimes. Why? Because Christianity proposes a radically different way to understand not only the human person, but how society should be ordered.
When you mentioned the 80,000 people sacrificed, in part because Aztec culture worshiped the sun and believed that the sun wouldn't rise the next day unless a new person was sacrificed. How many of them were children that were sacrificed?
I said I didn't want to get into this, Tom. A lot of them were children. And this is another thing that you see repeated across time and space and cultures, is the sacrifice of children, whether it's to, in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, child sacrifice there to Moloch and Baal, or it's the Aztecs, or it's the Carthaginians. Even a few years ago, I discussed this in the book, they discovered in Peru the largest child sacrifice site that the archaeologists had ever found outside the Templo Mayor in what is now Mexico City, something like the remains of 140 children. So this is a theme throughout pagan societies as well, is that it's not just that human beings are victimized, but children specifically.
Thank you. Having told us a little bit about some of the fruits of pagan society, you in the book define paganism in one sentence. Nothing is true, everything is permitted, right? How has that worked out in what you describe as pagan America today? Yeah.
One of the things to understand about pagan societies is that they embrace a kind of radical subjectivity, right? The Christian religion poses transcendent universal truths that are true to all people and across time and space. The transcendent moral truths, right? The pagan worldview or the pagan ethos rejects that and imposes a worldview where truth is based on power. It's based on coercion. And so it can be different and it can change, and there need not be any overarching objective moral or transcendent truth. So nothing is true, everything is permitted, everything that you can get away with, right? There's also, on a sort of a cosmological level, a rejection of, if you reject like a transcendent truth and a transcendent moral order, you're free to divinize things in the here and now. Things, created things, natural phenomenon, even people, like as the Roman Empire did with Caesar, a god man, right? And the kind of society that emerges from that cosmological vision is a society that's based on force and coercion. And so what we are seeing, and to try to relate it to what I argue is happening to the United States as we become more post-Christian, is that we're starting to see this way of thinking displace the older way of thinking, which was the Christian kind of order. And so I don't have to explain to anybody here the emergence in our time of a kind of radical subjectivity, that you sort of speak your own truth, or you live your own truth, or if you feel like you're a woman but you're a man, then you can become a woman because that's true for you, and it doesn't matter what biology says, and it doesn't matter really what science says, and so accompanied with this way of thinking is a kind of disfigurement of reason, right, itself. And we see that all through our society today, not just with the transgender issue, but even during COVID, we saw it with like basic epidemiology, right? These things that we were told we had to do because we were following the science. We weren't following the science. We were expected to follow orders, but they weren't based on science. And there's a growing disregard actually for science. It's ironic, for as much as sort of the progressive left claims to be the champions of science, when science comes up against their agenda or their desires or their will, they will quickly discard it and ignore it and not talk about it. And I discussed this in a chapter on abortion and euthanasia. We see how the justifications for abortion have changed since Roe versus Wade. They've totally been transformed from being based on rationality and science and age of viability, and it's just a clump of cells, and it's not a human being, and so it's no different than getting an appendectomy or something like that. That was the initial justification for it. Medical technology advanced very quickly, probably more quickly than Roe v. Wade's champions had anticipated it would, and the justification changed to the Clinton era safe, legal, and rare. It's an unfortunate thing, but we just want it to be safe, and we want it to be legal, and let's not talk about it too much, right? That was kind of the thinking behind safe, legal, and rare. Now there's a completely different justification for it. We're in an era now where we're supposed to view abortion as a positive good. People are supposed to be proud of their abortions. They're supposed to shout your abortion, right? So if anybody remembers that from about 2015, that's when that sort of line of argument entered the public space. Shout your abortion, don't apologize for it. It's women's empowerment. We need abortion for women to be free, for women to be equal. That's a totally different basis. And it's coincided with advances in medical technology that have moved back the age of viability far beyond what the authors of Roe v. Wade could have ever imagined, right? Such that you now have laws on the books in different states in the country that a unborn child at the same gestational age born in one state will have all the medical care in the world to save their life if they're born prematurely. And a child of the same age can be dismembered in the womb and murdered legally. That is totally unreasonable. It makes no rational sense at all. And so what is the basis upon which we say this is a person who deserves protection and deserves life-saving care, or this is a person with no rights, and in fact, whose total denial of rights is the only thing that can vindicate the so-called right of women to equality, right? It's only based on the desire of the mother at this point. In other words, will, capricious, subjective will and desire. It's a totally pagan moral framework upon which abortion today is justified. And I think we have to just recognize that for what it is. It has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with will and power.
Thank you. You mentioned science and biology. Let's continue with that thread. When I think of paganism on the one hand and scientific materialism on the other, I think of them as opposed. But you show me in your book that they go together. Would you explain that?
Pure scientific materialism, right? Divorced from any sense of revelation or of natural law, is a disfigurement of reason, I think, and of rationality. The Christian tradition teaches that there's no conflict and no contradicting between faith and reason. In fact, the Christian tradition has always maintained that they're complementary; they go together, that they strengthen one another, that the truths about the created world that are available to our reason and that we can discover through the scientific method and through our own investigations reflect the truths about God, right? And they reveal the truth about His creation. And that has always been how Christians have understood science and the scientific method. The idea that the only thing that's true are things that we can measure with our instruments is a relatively recent belief that has a very sort of anemic tradition behind it. I think most people know that's not true. That the only thing that's real is what we can measure with our instruments. Our experience, just as people, as human beings, sort of belie that claim. But it is a useful. It's a useful tool, I would say, of social control that we see deployed all the time now. That you can't make any claims that are not based in a kind of radical materialist worldview, right? That have some sort of measurable evidence to back them up. I talk at one point in the book about how this worldview is now combining, which is, as I say, it's a recent, like the totally materialist scientific worldview is a recent kind of just in the past century or two. In the long view, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. I talk about how that is combining now with a kind of re-enchantment of the world, a post-materialist, post-scientific mindset that is being adopted on both the left and the right, but more so, I think, on the left, or at least it's more visible right now on the left, where you have people who embrace spirituality, right, but not religion. Like, I'm spiritual but not religious, but are also very adamant that Christian claims about supernatural phenomenon or the immaterial world have to be rejected, but other claims, fundamentally pagan claims, should be accepted, like the faith claim that a man is a woman or a woman is a man, right? Or that an unborn child isn't a human being, or even something like critical race theory, like race essentialism. You know, the creation of a core identity that has to be acknowledged and respected, and that is somehow irreducibly. A defining feature of not just an individual person, but of whole groups of people. There's kind of uneasy melding together of these things. C.S. Lewis talks about this in the Screwtape Letters that I discuss in one chapter. He calls this the creation of the materialist magician. And in the Screwtape Letters, Screwtape is a demon, and it's a series of letters to his understudy, Wormwood, who asks Screwtape whether or not he should keep himself hidden from the patient, right? The person that Wormwood's trying to damn, right? And Screwtape has a great answer. He says, for now, our policy is to remain hidden, because if we reveal ourselves and prove the supernatural is real, we can make no materialists and no skeptics. And we want to keep people as skeptical materialists so that our operations to them remain hidden. They don't believe in demons. And so we're free. We have a free hand to operate. But he says, we look forward to a time when we can create a new kind of man, a materialist magician, who maintains his skepticism about the supernatural, but believes in forces while refusing to acknowledge spirits, and even though he veritably worships them. And he says, when we can create the materialist magician and meld the materialist skeptic with the magician, then the end of the war will be in sight. Right, the end of the war, their war against God, and the reason they want to maintain skepticism and materialism is so they close off belief. Screwtape says, in the enemy, by which he means God. If you keep men skeptics, they won't believe in God, but then you can sneak in pagan beliefs, right? Spiritualisms without religion, and that's what we see happening now. That's behind the rise of the nuns, and it's behind the growth in actual, like, what I call therapeutic paganism, which is like what you see on witch talk and social media.
And when you say nuns here, you don't mean Catholics, you mean NONES, those who in surveys say they have no religion.
Not NUNSs. We need more of those. More nuns and fewer nuns. Sorry.
Thank you. The other side might respond. They might say, okay, you make the case we're entering a new pagan era. Why is that going to be so bad? Why is post-Christian America, which already has a constitution with protection of freedom of religion, protecting individual equality, limiting government, they might say back to you, what's the big deal?
Yeah, why can't we have all the benefits of Christendom without the Christian faith, right? Well, something happened earlier this week, which is a good way to. It's a good frame for talking about this. And maybe some of you saw this clip of the famous atheist Richard Dawkins. This interview where he was complaining about how there was too much priority in Britain being given to public commemorations of Ramadan, right? And this bothered him because he said Britain we're culturally a Christian country, and so we shouldn't prioritize Ramadan and these Islamic holidays. We should prioritize the recognition of Christian holidays. Now, and he said, I say that, he's like, I'm a cultural Christian. He's like, I want to be clear, I'm not a believing Christian. But I like, Christian culture. And he's like, we have beautiful cathedrals and we have beautiful parish churches. And I love the old Christmas carols and the hymns. And he's like, and I like that stuff. I'm paraphrasing him, right? And he's like, but, I recognize that there are fewer and fewer believing Christians. And he said, and that's a good thing. We want fewer believing Christians and more cultural Christians. And it was an amazing clip, like, for a guy who's supposed to be so smart, it's just amazing he would say something like this in public. On what basis does he think that you can keep the cultural Christianity without Christians? He should know in his own country, eventually, if you don't have enough believing Christians, the cathedrals empty out and they become mosques, or they become nightclubs, or they become, condos, which is like happening like in front of his face, right? You don't get to keep the accoutrement of Christian civilization without active Christian belief. We were talking before this about this, and I mentioned the French philosopher Remy Brague in the book. He says, I'm gonna paraphrase him too because I haven't memorized the quote, but he said European civilization owes its existence to faith and not calculation. In other words, not to Christianity, but to the Christian faith being lived out actively among a believing people. This idea that even famous atheists like Richard Dawkins have, that you can just keep all of the wonderful things about Christianity and not have any believing Christians is being disproven in real time. It's amazing to me that he could be sawing off the branch he's sitting on and not realize it. It's happening all around us, and part of the reason I wrote the book is because at some point, the instances of this stack up so much that you want to just lay it out and say, this is happening, and in some ways has already happened. Like Britain is further into the post-Christian era than we are. Their churches have emptied out, and to your original point, saying like, well, why can't we have these protections? Why can't we just keep them and kind of just keep on, trundle along with a form of government based on Christianity without actual Christianity? Because once the religion goes, the form of government goes quickly thereafter. In Britain right now, for example, and I discuss this in the book, it's a crime. Like the cops will come and put you in handcuffs and arrest you, and if you like fight with them, they'll tase you and beat you up and throw you in the back of their cars. To stand outside of an abortion clinic within a set perimeter and pray silently to yourself, that's a crime in many parts of Great Britain and Ireland, and those kinds of laws are coming to other parts of the EU right now as well. The police will come up to you, and there's videos of this on Twitter recently. The head of a pro-life group in Britain was approached by the police and said, "What are you doing here?" I'm just here. I'm not bothering anybody. There wasn't a demonstration. It was one woman, and they said, "Are you praying?" She says, "I may be." He said, "All right, well, you're going to have to come with us." That's a law in the United Kingdom right now.
silently pray. She was taken into
Yeah.
jail for silently praying.
Right. So the idea that, and here, we may not be there yet, but we are to the point where if you go protest outside an abortion clinic, you may be facing a decade in federal prison, as a group of pro-life activists are right now facing. Or you may have the FBI SWAT your house and drag you off in your underwear at 7 a.m, as they did with Mark Hawk, right? Who was acquitted by a jury in after an hour. But our DOJ, the Merrick Garland DOJ, is doing this right now under the pretext of these federal laws that they have weaponized against Christians who have a problem with abortion, right? So we're kidding ourselves and frankly not paying very close attention if we think that we're going to be able to keep all of our rights and protections in a totally post-Christian America.
Yes. Well, I think you have a quote from Chesterton that's really, I think, the perfect rejoinder to Dawkins' argument that I like this Christian culture stuff, but let's get rid of the beliefs. Chesterton says this, and this is quoted in John's book, quote, "Some say it is impossible to return to the past, but the truth is that there is now nothing before us but the choice between two paths which both return to the past. We can return to some sort of Christian fellowship, or we can return to some sort of pagan slavery. There is no third road." And
I chose that as the epigraph for the book because I came across that in a letter that Chesterton wrote to the head of the Knights of Columbus in the United States after he visited here. And it, it's not the kind of thing that people want to hear, right? Especially Americans. We're always kind of looking forward and we're looking to the future, and we're sort of like, almost like in our DNA to be like progressing into the future. But the truth is the way forward is the way back, and the two things that lie behind us are some sort of Christian fellowship. I think he actually says Catholic fellowship, but we'll just say Christian fellowship, and some sort of pagan slavery. And the reason he says pagan slavery is because pagan societies in their most advanced forms always take the same form, and they're slave empires, because that is in accordance with the internal logic of a pagan worldview. And so we need to understand that, and we need to accept that this is happening, and not until we accept that it's happening can we even begin to think clearly about like what it means for us and for our kids and our grandkids.
Yes, and with regard to all the crazy cults that have arisen in claiming scientific validity of late, I think Chesterton also foresaw that. Chesterton said 100 years ago, the problem when people stop believing in God is not that they won't believe that they will believe in nothing. The problem is that they will then believe in anything. And here we are. Another question for you. Critics are going to say there's a lot of gloom and doom in your book.
I know what you're talking about. This is the burning church on the cover. I didn't design the cover, but I like it.
Before we turn to our audience's questions here, is there anything that we who are ordinary people can do?
No. So as I was saying, the one of my motivations for writing the book is to just sort of help people to wrap their minds around what's happening, to accept what's happening, and to begin to think about what that means and what to do about it. And a lot of books like this, or I don't know, just a lot of books that are written today that are commenting on our current like cultural and political moment, they always have a chapter at the end that's like these 10 steps to save America, right? And I didn't do that. We don't have a chapter like that in this book. The last chapter is called the Boniface option, and it's a loving jibe at Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, which I talk about in the book and which really got a lot right. That came out in 2017. I think things have progressed much more quickly than even Dreher thought they would, certainly than I thought they would. 2017 seems like a long time ago. and a lot has happened since then. The idea being that we cannot just retreat into our families and our churches and our homeschools and hope to be left alone, right? The pagan regime will not leave you alone. One of the things about pagan societies is that there has to be kind of unanimity of practice, and that's why all pagan societies had like a state or official morality. We don't have to get into this, but Christianity was the first religion that joined religion and morality together. Faith and action. In Rome, it was different. There was all kinds of different religious cults that had their own rites and had their own practices, but there was a state morality that everyone had to adhere to. Everyone had to perform, and even the Christians, during times of persecution, the Romans would just want the Christians just to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar. You don't have to, believe, none of us do, but just a pinch of incense to Caesar. Just perform the state morality, and the Christians wouldn't do that, and they suffered terribly because of it. There was a great age of martyrdom on account of that. But part of what I argue in the Boniface option is that we have to have a kind of confidence and a kind of boldness about our faith that takes it out of the private sphere and into the public square. We're told, by the secularists and by the materialists, by the separation of church and state crowd, that you just keep your religion in your church and keep it in your home, but don't bring it out here. We have to have exactly the opposite attitude. And what I argue in the book is you're not going to we're not going to reverse this in our lifetimes, or maybe even our children's lifetimes. But we do have to fight, and we do have to try to find ground on which we can win. And that means finding ground on which you can fight and win means don't try to take over the Austin City Council, because it's not going to happen. But maybe you can take over the city council in a smaller town. Maybe you can take over a library, your local public library. Maybe you can take over your local public school district, your school board. And you can get the pornography out of the schools, and you can get it out of the drag queen story hour out of the libraries, and you can bring back a Christmas parade that celebrates Christ at every December, and you can have public acknowledgments of our Christian heritage. Those are the kinds of things we have to start thinking about, not just our little homeschool pod or our little church or our community. Those things are good and necessary, but we need to have an outward-facing Christianity that proclaims in the public square the truth of our religion and the necessity for our religious faith, really for our whole way of life. And that means getting more comfortable with confrontation. And it means getting over the misconception that winsomeness and likability are going to be enough to survive what's coming, and to convert people too. This is the other thing, and I'll stop. We'll take questions. But when you love people, you tell them the truth, right? And so, if we love the world, we have to tell the world the truth, and that means for Christians that means. That is going to mean more and more proclaiming the truth to a culture that absolutely rejects it and is becoming hostile in the face of the truth. But that's what if you want to love your neighbor, tell him the truth. So,
and expect trouble.
Yeah.
Saint
Boniface was cut down by a pagan war party.
Yes.
So.
Well, Christ told us, in this world you will have trouble. But he adds, but be of good heart, for I have overcome the world. Yeah. Right? And on a more mundane level, a reason for hope here, you mentioned that we need to get outside of our houses and our home schools. The last few years, primarily as a result of everyday parents going to school boards because they saw on the iPads during the lockdown what their kids were being taught, We got a ban on critical race theory passed. We got a ban on DEI. That was because parents became awakened and energized and angry. And it continues to go on right now.
Yeah, and that's what I mean about fighting on ground you can win. There's ground that you can win in Texas, right? And TPPF has done a great job of that and of finding those places, claiming that ground, pushing back. You know, we see it in Florida as well. You know, great strides have been made there. So it's possible to push back. It's possible to take ground and to reclaim spaces, and that's what we need to do. In addition to cultivating thick community and building, great homeschools and charter schools and building up great church communities. It's a both and.
Excellent. Thank you, John. It's now time for your questions. If there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, as you'll see here, we have a couple people with microphones. Please say your name so that the FBI knows. Go ahead.
Hello, FBI. I'm definitely not Austin Brasco. I wanted to rewind kind of back to your one of your first statements where you said the pagan culture is all about might makes right. So kind of in that understanding, where do you place the Solomonic gold of people like Aristotle and Plato who directly counter that, even though they're not part of the Christian culture? Christian thinkers like Aquinas and Augustine rely heavily on them.
One of the first things that Aristotle says is that there's some people are naturally slaves and some people are naturally masters. And then he goes on to talk in his politics about, how to best to order a society, right? And he's talking about democracy, he's talking about these different forms, and we focus on that. We forget that right from the outset, he posits a world in which some people are just naturally slaves and some people are naturally masters. And then what he goes on then to talk about are the masters who are peers and who are who have to have these forms of consent between them, right? The great mass of everyone else is a slave, and they don't get a say in the politics, right? They don't get a vote in the assembly of the city-state, right? So he was right about a lot, right? But we have to understand when Aristotle is talking about people who are political and social peers and everyone else who is not a peer and is a slave, right? That was the reality of his society, and that was the context in which he and Tom, you probably know more about this than I do, but I think that's one thing that gets glossed over when we talk about like Aristotle's politics, is the extent to which he accepted like the basic pagan schema of rulers and ruled, slaves and masters.
Yeah, Aristotle rejected conventional slavery. Right. Slavery by force, he said, is unjust everywhere. But he did say that some human beings are to others as animals are to human beings, and they're better off if enslaved. Now, and then, as you say, he also, while rejecting conventional or force-based slavery, his best regime has slavery in it. So he does make that concession.
Right.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. We're going to go back and forth because we have people also texting in questions. So we will get to you as soon as I read the first question that's come online. And that is this. Regarding the book's cover, do you expect Christians to eventually become victims of violence at the hands of the U.S. government? Is this where things are heading, or will the decline continue as it is with people voluntarily dissociating from the church, or to quote the end line from the poem, "This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper"?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do expect there to be active persecution of Christians by the state. I think that the broad outlines of that are coming into being already. And I think that we need to look to some of our peer countries for kind of what we can expect down the road. Now, in Canada, they're not having like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police go burn down Catholic churches, but I don't know if y'all remember a few years ago, there was this hoax about mass graves discovered at the indigenous schools. Totally a false story. There was never any mass graves discovered. There was never even a single grave discovered, right? Except for in cemeteries where everyone knew there had been graves all along. But on the basis of that story, dozens of Catholic churches were burned down, vandalized, and destroyed all across Canada, while the Prime Minister and other leading government figures cheered it on, right? So again, the Canadian Mounted Police were not burning down churches, but the government was complicit in what became a kind of anti-Catholic pogrom that swept through the country, and for which there was never any repercussions. There was never any accountability. It was an explicitly anti-Christian, I guess pogrom is the best way to describe it. It swept through, and then it was over, and there was no accountability for it, and it was based on a libelous lie, right, about something that never happened. I think those kinds of things are done on purpose. They are done on purpose to tear down Christian communities, to demonize them, to mark them out as enemies of the regime, no less than very conspicuous, over-the-top FBI raids on anti-abortion protesters are meant to do the same thing here. So it's not, it's not like next week, Joe Biden's going to proclaim that anyone who goes to church is going to be arrested, right? It's going to move a little bit more slowly than that, and it's going to happen in these indirect ways. But those indirect ways are becoming more frequent. They're becoming more explicit, and they're clearly happening with the imprimatur of approval by our sort of ruling regime. So I do think that we should, this burning church on the cover, that could have been taken in Canada a few years ago when they burned down a bunch of churches. They tried to do the same thing during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, attacking churches along with all other sorts of buildings and businesses, and nothing ever happened. There was never any accountability for that. In many cases, and people stop paying attention, right, because they have lives and they're not, have the unfortunate job I do of watching the news very closely. But in many, many cases of those riots of 2020, the local DAs just dropped charges. There was never any repercussions for any of that.
Thank God that would never happen in Austin. Oh, wait. Next question.
Thank you for this event. And John, thank you for this penetrating look at the problems of our age. It seems to me we could distill down what you're talking about in terms of a rejection of objective truth, that is God himself, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and a substituting of that of man making himself God.
Yeah.
My truth is king. Yeah. And if I'm powerful, I get to exert my truth on everybody else. Yeah. And William Penn sort of said, if men will not be governed by God, he will be ruled by tyrants. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, you talk a lot about Christianity as being the source morality bedrock. And I wonder if we have to make a distinction between the Catholic Church and the disciples of Christ who follow the church, and Protestant Christianity, which seems to have started essentially as a rejection of the objective apostolic truth and the divine deposit of faith, versus Protestants who held up the Bible as the sole source of truth and everybody's subjective interpretation of their reading of Scripture. Every man is their own pope, in a sense, as a descent into that same relativism that's causing the problems that paganism is causing.
Yeah. So as Tom mentioned, I work at the Federalist. I'm a senior editor, and we don't have a huge staff. People a lot of times are surprised to find out how few people work at the Federalist, but we have we're spread out over the whole country, so we have like an ongoing chat, where we talk about story assignments and that, and we're a diverse group of Christians at the Federalist. We have Catholics, Lutherans, evangelicals, even one Jewish guy from New York. And some of our discussions on Christianity and the differences between the denominations can get heated. And so at one point, our CEO declared a new rule: no sectarian violence in the chat. So no sectarian violence at the book talk, Gibbons. No, that's a good point, and I don't get into it in the book. My own priors are pretty obvious, I think. In the book itself, I'm a Catholic. I joined the Catholic Church. I was received, into the Catholic Church in 2018 here at St. Mary. So I'm one of those jihadist Catholic converts. That's like really strident, but yeah, the point about Protestantism is well taken. I take as my starting point in the book that it is possible to have a Christian society, a republican form of government with a Christian people, broadly conceived, Catholic and Protestant together, as long as the integrity of the faith is maintained, right? And so there's a separate question about whether or not the integrity of the faith can be maintained among Protestants. And that is a question I don't get into in this book. No. And that Tom is telling me we're not going to get into here. But
we are not going to restart the English Civil War.
But the basic point that you have to you have to accept the basis of objective moral truth in order to maintain a society that respects individual rights and respects the Christian doctrine of Imago Dei. Yes, is totally correct, and we don't have that kind of a society anymore. All of us were born into a world in which that was already passing away quickly, and so here we are in pagan America.
Yeah. Almost 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, said, today the battles are between and among different religions. But he said the time is coming when the battle will be between religion on the one side and irreligion on the other. So in that Tocquevillian spirit, perhaps believing Catholics and Protestants should focus on the common enemy, the enemy who wants to destroy both of them. And once we vanquish that enemy, then we can get back to arguing over which side of the altar to worship on. Yes?
Amen.
I was wondering, have you ever read the book A Study in Tyranny by Alan Bullock? It was published in 1952.
I have not.
It's a detailed analysis, probably one of the best, of the early 20th century and the rise to power of Hitler. Mm-hmm. One of the key things in there that a lot of people don't really understand is where the real tyrants are. The government's just the conduit for control, and the public-private partnerships are being told that this is a great way to go, when in fact it's the source of the problem. How do we address this issue of the real tyrants that are hiding in the background that are controlling the governments?
Yeah, one of the things about fascism is that it's a marriage of government power and corporate power, right? The means of corporate production being placed at the disposal of the state, right? So that kind of fascism is coming back in our time, right? As increasingly the corporate powers are working hand in glove with the administrative bureaucracy or the permanent state, right? We saw this we saw a lot of things during COVID, but we saw this during COVID with the pharmaceutical companies working together with the administrative state to kind of, concoct these shots and then mandate that everyone has to take them, right? With very little oversight and very little regard for any kind of harm they might do. But yeah, you mentioned the Nazi regime. This was sort of like a preview of a post-Christian society. Like Nazi Germany was absolutely post-Christian. and very pagan, and this will probably be taken out of context if people are recording it, but to their credit, they at least accepted the implications of their rejection of Christianity, right? They came to the same conclusion that the Marquis de Sade came to during the French Revolution, and I write about this in the book as well. If you reject Christianity, then you reject any basis for saying that we can't, enslave and exterminate whole groups of people, right? The Marquis de Sade was not just an advocate of abortion. He thought that murder and torture and rape and all kinds of things were totally justified and that aristocrats like him should be allowed to do them at will. He accepted a post-Christian morality, which is to say him and the Nazis, they embraced a pagan morality in which force was what determined what was right. And they were, again, at least they were honest about it and didn't try to justify what they were doing by appeals to Christian morality. They were done with all that and proceeded accordingly.
Thank you. I'm afraid to say that we're out of time. Please join me in thanking John Davidson.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. I think we have books out there too. Yeah.
John's book is out, right? We have many copies, and I think John is willing to sign copies for folks.
Yeah, you got to pay extra for that. I'm just kidding.
Thank you, everyone.